Let me just welcome everybody and thank you all for your interest in this timely topic of the Paris Accord and the United States participation or not in it. I want to thank also my friends who are the real experts here. I just play an expert, in Congress, but I do have opinions, and it seems I'm trying to get used to the fact that when I offer an opinion, sometimes people are interested in it, and if it's an opinion that is different than the one I used to have, or one that is different than others close to me have, it gets even more attention. So I just thought it'd be helpful to have a little forum today with a panel of experts whom I'll let them introduce themselves and their credentials here in a moment. But what I thought I would do to just open this up is to just give a little bit of background on what led to my position, which is not all that dramatic, except that it's a dramatic situation, I guess. As I think probably all of you know, or most of you know, I was an early Trump supporter. Previous to being in Congress, I served as an energy regulator in North Dakota, cited lots of pipelines and wind farms and transmission lines that carried all kinds of power on them and regulated rates, which was far more interesting. But and consequently, with my background both as a regulator and a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and my early endorsement of the President, I found myself helping him and his team a fair bit on energy policy. In fact, there were a couple of times when I was on forums with Trevor Hauser, Secretary Clinton's chief energy advisor, and Trevor and I, in fact, had I thought one of the more interesting debates I've ever participated in at Richmond Law School. And I then advocated that I thought Paris was, a silly accord to get involved in. It looks like to me it looked like a treaty that wouldn't have any of the obligations of a treaty. And so my advice to the campaign was just let's get out of Paris. Say you'll get out of Paris. We're not going to unilaterally disarm our economy while 190 other countries just wait for us. And one of the things that always bothered me about the Paris Accord was the argument from the left being that the whole thing hinged on the United States. That always bothered me because I thought, well, if we're so darn important to it, why if it's such a great idea, why do 190 other countries require our involvement? If it's the world's greatest deal. So fast forward a little bit, Donald Trump becomes president. And a couple of months ago, I started hearing reading the media more than anything. I didn't hear anything, just reading media and seeing that there's some discussion about perhaps staying in. And I was asked rather spontaneously, at least it was spontaneous to me, by a reporter, if I thought there was any merit in Secretary Tillerson's idea that we should consider remaining in the accord. And my instincts immediately were, well, he's a smart guy, and I know his background, but he's got this new job that requires being the nation's leading diplomat, and it occurred to me then that if in fact 190 other countries require the United States to stay in it, either it's not the world's greatest deal or we have a lot of sway. And it just seemed to me, and I articulated this off the top of my head at the time, and I've never regretted saying it. It seems to me that staying in the accord just might have provide the United States a lot of opportunity to take our global leadership under our conditions to a very timely forum. And that if the president and his team decided that we should stay in the Paris Accord and use our influence on that global forum, that hey, let's at least put some conditions. Let's put some domestic conditions and provide some opportunities to do what we do best as the world's leader, reestablish ourselves as the world's leader, and then help the world meet our conditions rather than us always being run over by the world's conditions, which would seem to me was happening for the last 8 years. And so that simple, basic message took hold with some folks. I'm still not one that says, that if the president asked me today, should I stay in or stay out, that I'd be sure. I'm not sure what I would tell him. But I know for sure what I tell him is if we're going to stay in, let's do it under our conditions. And I do see, and the longer I think about it, the more I've spoken about it to people, the more convinced I am, I think that there's a lot of upside to staying in if we do this right. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons and the ways I think it can in an opening statement, but rather we'll let the experts speak to some of that, and then I'll fill in where I think I might have an opinion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, who's written some wonderful things, by the way. Scott, I've appreciated what you've written about the domestic agenda within the context of Paris, and it's been very informative to me.
Well, Congressman, thank you very much. I appreciate your remarks on that. Look, you can be, and I think you sense some of the room for discussion and open debate that exists on Paris in the Congressman's remarks. You can, in fact, be agnostic on whether the Paris Agreement, as it's currently negotiated, is a good idea or a bad idea, whether it makes sense to keep a seat at the table or whether it makes sense to push back from the table. You can be agnostic on all of that. However, among all of the reasons that you might articulate in order to address what you would decide about Paris and whether you would oppose it or support it, problems with Clean Air Act regulatory reform wouldn't really be on the list. In other words, the argument that you must move away from Paris or you won't be able to achieve or implement the clean air regulatory reform agenda that this administration has already committed itself to, up to and including executive orders and presidential memoranda, doesn't strike me as an argument that has a lot of merit to it. I mean, first, Paris does not create enforceable obligations. It was, and as many of the folks in this room who oppose Paris would indicate, it was not submitted for ratification. In fact, I remember well, former Administrator Gina McCarthy giving an interview where she once accidentally called Paris a treaty. Remember that? And then she was forced to correct the record, and there were, a great rending of cloth and a beating of drums to make sure that she was clear that it was not a treaty, that it did not have essentially enforceable obligations. Second, while Paris does encourage, forward momentum to addressing our national contributions for emissions reductions, it does not require a particular regulatory outcome. For example, it does not require the Clean Power Plan. It does not require an endangerment finding under the Clean Air Act. In fact, I'll let you in on a little secret, it doesn't even require a Clean Air Act. There are lots of things that you could do to advance toward meeting national contributions that would not require any of those particular regulatory mechanisms. Third, the last administration actually undermined the case for the Clean Power Plan itself being any kind of an essential component to the Paris strategy. McCarthy, again, Gina McCarthy, my touchstone on all matters, said that the Clean Power Plan achieved little additional reductions above and beyond what current market trends would accomplish for decreasing emissions of carbon. And I remember well also the Assistant Administrator for Air, Janet McCabe, testifying in front of your committee, Congressman, when she was asked which of the climate endpoints, the alleged harms related to climate change, did the Clean Power Plan actually address? And she was embarrassingly walked through each of those endpoints, and in each occasion she said, no, it doesn't really address that, it doesn't address that. And finally she said, that's just not the way climate change works, all right? So to my way of thinking, that establishes the bona fides that you could be free to repeal, rescind, reform, as the President's executive order says, the Clean Power Plan without running afoul of the obligations of Paris, such as they are. Fourth, there are plenty of alternatives to command and control regulation to reduce carbon. And boy, we're seeing them all over the place, aren't we? With respect to clean energy, it's advancing irrespective of whether the Clean Power Plan was stayed, as it has been by the courts for several years. We've had a dramatic increase in the cost effectiveness of clean energy sources. We have the ever-present state actions, which require rather aggressive renewable fuels, renewable electricity standards in various states, particularly those states with large populations. We've had an increase in demand by residential consumers and by businesses for clean energy that continues irrespective of whether there's a Clean Power Plan or even a Clean Air Act. And we've had what we might euphemistically call a relatively stable tax platform for clean energy. The production tax credits and the investment tax credits for solar and wind. And Tom Reed, another good Republican member, has legislation to pick up the other orphan technologies that were left out. In addition, the reliance on traditional forms of fossil fuel has declined for reasons other than government action. For example, and I think I just recently saw a report from Colombia, and maybe you're going to touch on it, but a report from Colombia which said that natural gas low prices are responsible for 49% of the decrease in domestic coal consumption, and another 26% is because of lower demand for electricity due to energy efficiency or the lingering effects of slow economic recovery. The reason I point these out is those have nothing to do with governmental mandates that would emerge under the Clean Air Act. In fact, if anything, the last administration would be very hard-pressed to say that its governmental mandates advance the cause of natural gas production in the United States. I think quite the opposite would be true. And there are still other things that we can do to encourage clean energy to advance forward, whether it's sponsoring X Prizes for innovation, whether it's improving the infrastructure for natural gas. We were talking about pipelines a minute ago before the whole thing started, and it would be nice if a series of both administrative and legislative reforms were adopted that allowed us to build out the natural gas infrastructure of the country. And there are there's nuclear, of course, which I know Jeff can talk about at some length, things we can do for nuclear. Even for hydropower, the president's talked about, $1.2 trillion he'd like to see spent on infrastructure. And of course, some of that infrastructure talks about upgrading our public dams, cutting red tape toward addressing additional hydro, and that accounts for 12% of the current energy mix. So there are all kinds of reasons that you might want to reform the Clean Air Act, even if you stayed snug up to the table at Paris. You might want to, for example, take note of the fact that the last time we reauthorized the Clean Air Act was 1990. It's supposed to be on a 10-year reauthorization cycle. So I think that means we're 27 years into our 10-year cycle to reauthorize the Clean Air Act. That alone is a reason to engage in regulatory reform of the Act, even if one stayed connected to Paris. And there are some changes that are offered up to the Clean Air Act, which I think would make the conservative heart sing, but also encourage better energy efficiency among our power plants. And of course, my favorite example, for any of you who know me in the audience, you might know what I'm about to say, but reforming the New Source Review Program, for example, allows you to make efficiency improvement at power plants and not be penalized by our retrograde Clean Air Act. So you can do all of these things. A little old-fashioned regulatory reform might even enhance our leverage in an international context. I've brought a prop. Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus EPA, the year is 2006. We filed an amicus brief with the court in that famous Supreme Court decision, which acted as a starting pistol, if you will, for getting us to regulate CO2. And I filed this brief on behalf of Unions for Jobs in the Environment, which was 12 AFL-CIO member unions. And what this brief stood for the proposition of was, these unions were, in fact, had observer status during the UNFCCC process. And what it stood for the proposition was this: unilateral Clean Air Act regulations actually decrease the amount of leverage the United States has in multilateral forums like Paris. Now, we weren't talking about Paris, obviously, in 2006, but that was the argument we made before the court. Because if anyone here who's ever played any game of chance would know, if you give away everything that's in your hand before you sit down, you will not be a very effective negotiator, will you now? So in fact, not only is there no inconsistency between regulatory reform of the Clean Air Act and staying in Paris, but we might even improve the outcomes, if we indeed need to improve Paris, if we engage in regulatory reform and restore a little bit of the leverage we might need to negotiate a good outcome. And we argued that now I will stipulate the court did not agree with us in this, because the best arguments never get agreed to by the courts. But we did make that argument, and I still believe it to this day. So that's what I've got to say. Jeff?
Scott, thank you. And you've covered a lot of territory, and I'll try not to replow too much of it. My name is Jeff Merrifield. I'm a partner with the law firm of Pillsbury, and I head up the energy practice for the firm. It's funny, you were mentioning the Clean Air Act of 1992. I was a young Senate staffer at that point, sitting in the conference room in the Capitol while George Mitchell and John Chafee and C. Boyd and Gray and others, negotiated the final deal that resulted in that. And although there were discussions of global warming and carbon control at that time, thinking back on it and sitting in those conversations, the breadth to which the Clean Air Act has been taken in a manner which was not certainly the consensus, in my view, in that room. There were certainly probably a few people, including former Vice President Gore, who felt it was going to go the way it was. Certainly, to me, it went further than probably most of the people felt in that room. I would want to note, I've got a couple of my fellow attorneys here, Sheila Harvey, who is in our energy practice and leads our energy group, and Megan Hammond, who is an associate at our firm, who helped me out with some of the research on some of the work that we did. We had a number of clients of ours who were interested in the confluence of the Paris Agreement and how that related to both the Clean Power Plan and the endangerment finding. And we had a memo. Politico was nice enough to put it out on the web, but the bottom line conclusion that we had was consistent with what Scott just talked about, which is that nothing in the Paris Agreement is dependent on either the endangerment finding by U.S. EPA or on the Clean Power Plan. Conversely, nothing in the endangerment finding or the Clean Power Plan requires U.S. participation in the Paris Agreement. A suspension, revision, or rescission of the Clean Power Plan or the endangerment finding will not legally affect the position of the U.S. in remaining a party to the Paris Agreement. So Congressman, to that extent, I think your intuition was correct that we can move forward, still be a party to the Paris Agreement, and that doesn't affect what are obviously some strong arguments on the part of the Trump administration in repealing that. Another area I think we looked at was what are the ultimate outcomes from this? Well, if you look at the direction that we are going as a country in terms of our use of natural gas, in terms of the impacts that the renewable industry has had, actions being undertaken by the states, irrespective of whether the Clean Power Plan is repealed or not, could very well get us to greenhouse gas emission reductions within the range of what was agreed to in Paris by 2025, even if one were to say that's not the right way of going. To Scott's point, the agreement does not require us to reference either one of those acts. It did have some general references to the Clean Air Act, the Energy Policy Act, and the Energy Independence and Security Act. But again, we weren't tied to those, and it was really it has less of a forcing function than I think some would lead to believe. One of the things which I think is noteworthy, prior to coming to Pillsbury a couple of years ago, I worked for both the Shaw Group and CB&I, which were large contractors, and the time when I was there, Shaw was the largest builder of nuclear power plants, coal power plants in the U.S., and built the Cliffside power plant for Duke. That is the cleanest coal plant in the country. That coal plant switched over and they burn natural gas at certain points, and the reason that they do it is because the price of gas is so low, it doesn't make sense for them to do it. There are a number of coal plants out there, even if you withdrew the Clean Power Plan, which is the action that the administration is going to undertake. Many utilities, many of the customers I had said, we made our decision, some of these older, less efficient coal units are just going to shut down. And the driver was really natural gas. Gas has had such a huge impact, and I think we can't forget that in the overall discussion. From an impactfully, I think, we've looked very closely at the executive order that the President recently has given on the Clean Power Plan. And of almost any of the executive orders that he has issued, the potential powerful impact that that's going to have on the regulatory process here in Washington, D.C. cannot be understated. It forces executive departments and agencies to look at the issue of the burden of the regulatory structure on American energy independence. And it requires my old agency plus a host of others to go back and look at existing regulations and really review those in a brief period of time and come back with recommendations as to what to do going forward. That's one that we've looked at as a firm. We think that for U.S. industries, for consumers, for states, that is going to be a very significant tool going forward to reduce potential regulations and areas where I think the President has been concerned. So to us, that's one that's going to really take a whole lot of attention. Scott mentioned on the nuclear side, I do have to say I was a critic of the Clean Power Plan in the degree to which it discriminated against existing nuclear power plants. It did have some provisions for new generation, but certainly to the extent nuclear power represents 65% of the clean energy generation in the U.S., and the manner in which that Clean Power Plan discriminated against nuclear in vice wind and solar, to me, was really out of line. And so to that extent, certainly I welcome the President's decision to take a look back at where that was going. As you look internationally, and this goes finally to the last point, one of the last points you made, Congressman, and I'm in complete agreement. One cannot belittle the importance of being at the table. I was, in my former role, I was a commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I represented the U.S. in international nuclear agreements and treaty matters while I was in that role. I can tell you under a typical international structure, if you're not at the table, you're not at the table. And I think it is very important for the United States, for the President of the United States and the folks who are representing him to be there, to be in those discussions, to defend our interests. If we don't do that, if we simply withdraw from the accord, we're ceding the field to Russia, to China, and to some folks in Europe who simply do not look eye to eye and feel the way that we do. So I completely agree with you. I think it's important for us to be there. I think it's important for us to articulate the importance of U.S. American policies. And back to my prior point, nuclear is one that I think is very important for us to articulate. It is an important element of meeting commitments in a variety of ways. And so in that regard, Congressman, thank you very much for the role that you've taken in really bringing these issues to the fore.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the... There we go. Thank you very much, Congressman, for the opportunity to be here and help speak to the panel. My name is Keith Benish. I am a non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University now, among other things. Before that, I spent just about a decade in the legal advisor's office at the U.S. State Department. And although I will take the opportunity, since Scott brought up the report that was just put out by our founding director, Jason Bordoff, and also with Trevor Hauser that the Congressman referenced, I bet he didn't expect he would be getting shout-outs at this panel today.
Double shout-out.
Double shout-out. But I do recommend that to everyone. It is a very thorough look at the market dynamics that have been going on in the energy sector with respect to coal in the country. I would note that a similar collaboration of people had produced previous reports on export policy for LNG and export policy for crude oil, that they developed a reputation for being very objective in their analysis, sort of regardless of political views. But today I am here to speak primarily in the role as someone who worked for the State Department and the Legal Advisor's Office, including spending some time in the Treaty Affairs Office during the, I guess now 2 administrations ago of then President George W. Bush. With some views on just that question of the Paris Agreement. How does the United States enter it as an executive agreement, and what does it or does it not do to compel us to take any particular action under domestic law? And I had actually when the agreement was first agreed. Although I had been part of the negotiating team in early years under the UNFCCC, had left a year or so before the final negotiation, so I never negotiated over any of the specific text. And when it came out, just like anybody else might have, I went through and started flipping through it to determine what did it mean in terms of the U.S. being able to join it at that point in my capacity as a private person, but somebody with experience, and looked through it the way that I would any agreement that might be brought to me if I were sitting in the legal advisor's office. And the first thing you do when you try and make that determination of figuring out what are the constitutionally acceptable ways that the United States can join the agreement is you start to look for, first, is it meant to be legally binding under international law? And in this case, you pretty quickly get to the point where, yes, there's a lot of language in here that shows binding international commitments. So that immediately puts you into the point of deciding, well, can the U.S. join this as an executive agreement under the president's authority, or does it need to go to the Senate for advice and consent? And the president can join an international agreement and bind the United States under his own authority, pursuant to his own constitutional authority, pursuant to existing treaties that might put that sort of subject matter within the authority of the executive branch, or pursuant to existing legislation. And in the case of the Paris Agreement, and flipping through and looking at the provisions that include some legally binding obligations, I have them listed on the back still from my notes then, you quickly see that most of the binding obligations relate to sort of international communications, the sort of reporting that the U.S. does, the way we conduct our business there. That, by view of the executive branch through many different administrations and by view of the Supreme Court, is pretty squarely within the authority of the president under the Constitution. To the extent that there are provisions in the agreement that don't clearly fall under that sort of authority, one finds that they're generally things that repeat or build on obligations that the United States already has under the existing UN Framework Convention agreement. So again, it's something that by joining the agreement, the president is not requiring any new laws to be passed in the country to be able to implement it, can also join by that point. And in fact, as you go through and look through all of this, you don't find any provisions that require any particular action in the United States that the president cannot take under his own authority, which meaning, frankly, it's not even a close call as to whether or not this sort of agreement can be done as an executive agreement or not. It clearly can. And part of the reasons for that is that, for the points that have already been made by my colleagues and that I won't repeat but that I agree with, the provisions that relate to how the United States tries to achieve a goal of emissions reductions, what an emissions reduction goal might be, whether or not the U.S. can change its emission reduction goals, like none of those contain legally binding obligations under international law. None of those things contain any provisions that compel the U.S. to take any particular type of action to try and achieve the goals. And nothing prevents the U.S. from, or any other country from communicating a different goal for emissions reductions. And I assume we'll have more conversation and back and forth, but as far as the opening, I just wanted to reemphasize those points.
Thank you. I don't think I'm on. There we go. Thank you very much. And Scott, Congressman. I came to this in 1997, having left really a terribly prestigious law firm, possibly practicing with some of the best minds of my generation. I think, Scott, would you agree with that?
I agree with that.
I thought you might.
I agree with almost everything.
And went in-house with a company that had arranged its investment such that it bought things on the cheap because they weren't economic and set around to add value to them through political capitalism. I was like the cowboys in the Far Side cartoon. Hey, they're lighting their arrows on fire. Can they do that? And it quickly rushed me into the arms of hanging out my own shingle and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, with which I've been associated since. 20 years ago this month. Scott, did you? Happy anniversary. And other groups for which I do policy work in addition to my practice. And in that, I do a lot of Freedom of Information Act work. And Scott, you reminded me of I have the almost completely redacted "Don't Mention the War" email, the memo, the Copenhagen "Don't Call It a Treaty" email. And the only line not redacted is "Don't call it a treaty." So the question was about Keith's points. I mean, reasonable minds can differ, except really the question was, can President Obama do what he did? Well, he did. So I suppose that's not really on the table for discussion. Should he have? No, I think inarguably not. And the reason, particularly, because the lesson of Kyoto was these treaties are non-starters here. Don't call it a treaty. Makes it particularly grave that he just said, well, then we won't call it a treaty. The French Senate ratified it. In faraway Mexico, their Senate, with a remarkably similar process, ratified it. The Canadian Parliament, the German Parliament, the European Parliament, Japan, the Australian Senate Committee. I mean, it's a strange thing to do for all of these purely executive agreements. An awful lot of Senates are ratifying it. But can it be undone? And I suggest the argument is yes, for the same reasons it was done the way it was done. It's the same very broad latitude, what are you going to do about it approach that brought us the Paris Climate Treaty called an agreement. But my email from Scott yesterday was, does Paris create legal obligations? I think it's the wrong question. No one, I don't believe anyone will argue that it does. Many will argue that it affirms existing legal obligations, and because Paris will be the final argument in many actions, we could make clear, of course it has. Any Paris supporter will say, well, it has legally binding provisions. The agreement's not legally binding, just its terms. But we have a magic should put in Article 4, the same language, actually, that was in the UN Framework Convention, Article 3. It wasn't magic enough to make that not a treaty, but it made Paris not a treaty. That would be, it's really going to be a political question. So I think the question is I suppose the question is, at least at this table, Administrator Pruitt, wrong or terribly wrong to say that this is going to make getting out of the Clean Power Plan more difficult. And I think of course it will. It won't be claimed to have created new legal obligations, except that the provisions Keith pointed out. Yeah, there are legally binding provisions, they say, which may not be legally binding as recognized by most people here, but that's, well, these are and these aren't. What about domestically? We can all state our belief, and our belief will be colored by what we want to happen. We know this because all manner of parties are going to sue, saying because Paris, at least in part. For example, we have some data points. You've heard of the Climate RICO Attorneys General, I assume. They subpoenaed the Competitive Enterprise Institute for 10 years of almost all records beginning 20 years ago, among others. Their recruiting letter of March 7th last year actually stated that their reason for organizing as a coalition and pursuing the Climate RICO agenda was ensuring that the promises made in Paris become reality. It's in their recruiting letter we obtained under Freedom of State FOIA laws. So that's what they're going to do, and we know that, for example, Eric Schneiderman's office has already, before Paris, they had already drafted a complaint affirming the point, this won't be claimed to be creating new legal obligations, it's going to affirm them. Schneiderman's team had already drafted, we have the factual background under a FOIA request of their draft complaint plainly against federal agencies to compel them to regulate, but going back to the Framework Convention, Doha, Copenhagen, don't call it a treaty, but there will be much litigation by the activist AGs, by the children, you've seen how that litigation is proceeding, by the NGOs. They won't be stating now because Paris we have new obligations, they'll be reaffirming. Keith's group has done very detailed work in arguing that we need to regulate under Section 115 of the Clean Air Act and are advising the Climate RICO AGs that should be done. And of course, I think Paris will be a sort of a last straw, or anyway, another argument because of this line of agreements. So, numerous irons already in the fire, whether it will be the duty of care, whether it will be the public trust doctrine, the Clean Air Act. I mean, there will be everything argued, and I think we are 10 years past saying about the courts in the climate context, oh, they would never do that. So we can dispense with that. There are many rationalizations, we're hearing more every day, for staying in, let me phrase it properly, for President Trump breaking his promise to cancel U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Treaty. I think they are all rationalizations. There aren't reasons that sort of, well, President Obama, this is consistent with presidential authority or consistent with what others have done, or yes, he could do this, but should he have? Or let's just say there's a promise. It was a promise. Should President Trump keep his promise? We argue he should. We support him in that. My last point is I don't think any of these reasons are political. It strikes me that there is no political upside to the president to breaking this promise. The opposition will go to 11 no matter what he chooses. Even if he chooses the currently, if oddly fashionable, option of, well, let's stay in, but renegotiate our promise. Footnote, our first promise, by the way. This is a quinquennial. Every 5 years, you can adjust your promise anyway so long as it's tighter, Article 4, in perpetuity treaty, but we'll just renegotiate, or no. The difference between Paris and Kyoto is that our number isn't negotiated, it's asserted. That's what. So we will reassert a number, but it will be lower, our first number. That doesn't do anything, that'll stick the rest of us with it forever. And I just see, if anyone at the White House is taking into account political considerations, there just does not seem to be a political upside. We will argue about, well, should they, should he keep the promise? Should President Obama have done that? Well, he did it. So, and parties will argue in court that Paris is one more reason, reaffirming existing duties, existing obligations. But it does not create new legal obligations. But I assure you, much money, including mine as a taxpayer, unfortunately, will be spent litigating the obligations to regulate because Paris.
Well, thank you all. I just came from Administrator Pruitt's office, as a matter of fact. That was the last place I was before coming here. And I was curious about his argument about the domestic, is there a domestic legal argument? And I think you've all answered it. There sort of is, that it'll at the very least be a rhetorical argument, if not a legal argument if we don't exit. And the exiting, we at least remove that. Let me ask somebody, or all of you, your views on what I hear some saying, and what I think what compels me the most to reconsider is the larger diplomatic case for being the arbiter of a more reasonable global agreement, and then being perhaps the exporter of the solutions. In other words, if other countries are going to continue using fossil fuels that we no longer seem to want, and it breaks my heart. But if gas in the United States is a market force that's obviously having an impact on coal, but other countries are, coal is still more abundant, more available. Should we be helping them use their coal in a more responsible way? And is there a market opportunity for that? Whether it's technology, exporting our coal, nuclear certainly. Is that, as Jim said, just a rationalization, or is there a real global opportunity? Because there are some pretty big companies, pretty big technology companies in this country who feel like we might be missing out on a global market if we don't sit at that table. Is that too pie in the sky?
I'll take a quick head at it, and I'll just say the questions you pose, it reminds me a little bit of that letter that was circulating around town from Cloud Peak, where the suggestion was made that if there is investment to be made in new technology, and if that new technology is to find sort of international acceptability, that we might need some kind of a forum to argue in front of, basically, and that, like the old instruction on the back of the the lottery ticket says, you must be present to win. So if you are present, you have a better chance of arguing for it. And I do think there's something to be said there. We have a lot of policies in this country that we set. We maintain a system of national labs. I suggested during my opening remarks that there are other things that we could do that are certainly consistent with free market ideals like X Prizes and the like to encourage more innovation in the field, and having a forum could be helpful. I did want to also point out one thing. I do agree with Chris and everybody else that these arguments about Paris I would be surprised if they weren't raised in the context of suing over whether you can rescind the Clean Power Plan. And the reason I tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, is as sure as I'm sitting here, every argument you can think of will be raised, probably by every side. And that simply because there is an executive order that opens up a process to rescind the CPP is not a reason to suspect that it will be any less litigated by the Sierra Club and others. But I guess I would instruct them to take a look at their favorite law, at their favorite Supreme Court decision of all time, Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus EPA. And I pulled it up because in rejecting the argument that there was a link between the Clean Air Act and what EPA does and what we do in foreign policy, I'm not going to put Jeffersonian words in this particular court's mouth and say that they said there was a high wall of separation. But they did make an interesting point, not in dictum, but actually in the opinion itself. Congress did direct the EPA to consult with other agencies in the formulation of its policies and rules, says the court. But the State Department is absent from that list, okay? What they basically said is that the court itself disclaimed any expertise or authority to evaluate how foreign policy implications enter into what is a Clean Air Act consideration, and therefore suggested that there was a wall between what EPA would do, and so I'm talking now about administrative reforms or certainly legislative reforms, if you guys in Energy and Commerce will get your act together, which I hope you do, to do legislative reforms of the Clean Air Act, and the foreign policy implications that are administered by Keysold band of miscreants at the State Department. So at least that's what the decision that sets the tone for carbon's relationship to the Clean Air Act says.
Jeff?
Yeah, Congress, I would say I agree with Scott in terms of litigation. It's frequently throwing the spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. And I think in this case, certainly it'll be an argument. I won't disagree with that. The impactfulness, I think I would agree with Scott as well. I don't see that. To your other point, the United States historically has been a lead in the development of virtually every power source at one point or another. And we've had some, we developed it and sort of lost the lead. Wind and solar are examples of that. We have today, I think, some real opportunities in fossil generation. There's a technology that's being developed out in North Carolina called net power,
Yes.
which is a combustor technology which could be revolutionary in the ability to utilize America's coal assets and not have escape carbon emissions. There's a very strong development of advanced nuclear technologies that are out there right now. The United States is a leader in that. There are dozens of companies that are going down that route. So to the extent that we want to make sure that we have a leg up and an opportunity for American energy technologies to compete in the world marketplace and not get boxed out by others, I think is obviously some might call it a rationalization, but I think it's nonetheless a good reason why staying at the table and being part of that discussion is important.
Chris, is there a wall of separation between the State Department and the other agencies referenced in the EPA's, in Scott's favorite lawsuit?
Truly, I think Keith would be better positioned to answer that. There is, by all accounts, a shortage of personnel, and it's largely individuals who engineered the current situation who are placed in the position of asking if they did it right. Probably not the most appropriate way to get advice right now. But, Scott, you know we live in a world of page counts. Every argument will not be made, but this one will be made. Mm-hmm. This is consistent, the Schneiderman complaint that we obtained is consistent with the argument that prevailed at the district court in The Hague in the Urgenda Foundation versus Netherlands, compelling them to regulate even more, which we will consistently face because, of course, nothing ever proposed actually, according to the models, would detectably impact climate. So that's why, for example, Paris builds in, there's this talking point, well, we should stay in to avoid diplomatic blowback. Paris's design is diplomatic blowback, every 5 years spiking, but with a very robust industry running throughout until we relent, and each relenting merely marks the start of a new 5-year period. That's the design, every 5 years. It also is the beauty is you never have to go through this again. Is it a treaty? Why didn't we discuss State Department Circular 175 and so on? Well, we don't have to worry about that anymore under this design. I agree that any time the state intervenes, whether it's with a mandate, a prohibition, a coercion, or a subsidy, somebody will win. There will be losers, but creates jobs isn't really an argument. This is an energy-starved world. It's going to need more. It needs more now. There are truly energy-starved places, and they are going to get it. And we can provide it, and we really don't need a treaty masquerading as not a treaty or an agreement or a quinquennial pressure campaign to provide the world its energy. In fact, if you follow the history of this, there are an awful lot of principles in developing this which argue that actually energy, we need to dramatically reduce energy consumption, maybe level it out. But you see what happens. I understand the environmental groups may be exaggerating the numbers, but look at the numbers they associate with energy, fuel poverty deaths of seniors and the poor, the most vulnerable, and whose name this agenda is being advanced. Just in England and Wales, it went from, what, 2,500 projected until claimed over 40,000 last winter as these policies take root, coincidentally. But these are real people. When you, as the president famously said, make electricity rates necessarily skyrocket, what do you think that does?
Right. Well, let me just answer a piece of that. There's a lot going on in what Chris just said. But first of all, that Eric Schneiderman will make the argument, and that you have even a letter that is suggestive of this, does not surprise me. And I will tell you that Attorney General Schneiderman from New York and other attorneys general arrayed on that side of the issue made about every argument I can think of to try and support the Clean Power Plan. And what that earned them was the first stay of a rule of general applicability issued by the Supreme Court in over 200 years. So if with their argument selection, I almost want to spot Schneiderman another 5 or 10 minutes to talk about this in a court of a competent jurisdiction, because it'll just lose him another lawsuit.
Staying in Paris puts a U.S. stamp on affirming that there is something, that there is this terrible peril from carbon dioxide.
No.
And you don't believe it.
No, what I believe is that we have no trouble dismantling the Clean Air Act or dismantling, boy, strike that. We have no trouble dismantling the Clean Power Plan and reforming the Clean Air Act just because we stay in Paris. In fact, that Paris can give us additional credibility. In fact, one of the arguments that I think is persuasive, and in fact we made it in front of the court and Commonwealth of Mass, is that if we do pare back our domestic command and control requirements, it actually gives us more leverage to strike a better deal in an international forum. So the Paris of yore, you might have a point.
If you read the Todd Stern declaration to the D.C. Circuit saying, don't stay these rules, I'm hoping to promise them to someone in a few weeks.
Right.
Our leverage didn't seem to be
Right,
very long.
right.
I don't think there's this
And Todd Stern,
Todd
a lovely man, but it earned them all a stay from the U.S. Supreme
Does
Court.
this reduce Pruitt's?
And back in 2006, a rejection of that very argument. They knew it at the time. In fact, I think they overstayed their welcome by filing the Stern Declaration. I think that the U.S. federal government, the Obama administration, yeah. And as far as energy poverty is concerned, at least what we're talking about here is there is an approach which can allow for development of innovative energy technologies, can allow for both clean energy to proceed, baseload power to proceed, nuclear power to proceed, hydro power to proceed, and that it doesn't require the Clean Air Act to force it along. And does it require Paris to force it along? Probably not. But does Paris participation provide a forum to discuss it? Yes. So I think we can address, and I want us to address, in fact, you and I agree on this, that we should address energy poverty by advancing a true all-of-the-above energy strategy.
All of the above. All of the above doesn't require the state. All of the above is saying, and we're going to have a politically determined mix. You know, when every million that you coerce or mandate into something called a wind production tax credit, not singling out wind except the tax code does for these purposes, is a million you're not directing it, or doesn't go to curing cancer or inventing flubber or pixie dust. Why are you politically directing?
But the dramatic increase in cost effectiveness for clean power, coupled with the development of the shale gas revolution, which I will stipulate was not a product of the government, even though I realize Stephen Chu had trouble also stipulating to that fact. Those two developments advanced our cause toward meeting our Paris goals markedly, and yet have nothing to do with governmental mandates, not with mandates.
So you're saying we can do this even if Paris, or we can do this if Paris? Or is it just sort of, the R word that didn't sit well, is that a rationalization?
Well, I'm just suggesting that there's, don't knock rationalizations. I think you're ahead with that one.
I was going to say DC would be a very lonely place if we didn't have rationalizations, but
Keith, let me ask you, that you're a former State Department guy, I mean, is this forum being overstated as a forum for good diplomacy and export opportunity and influencing the world, or not? Or is it just the one that's in front of us, and so we're talking about it?
I think that there are, and again, Scott and Chris, and we've all made a variety of points to stick to your question, because I'm going to say, I think that there are a few forums internationally where a country wants to be involved in helping shape and determine energy policy with its partner countries that it cooperates a lot, as well as countries that it might be more antagonistic with. There are a few forums that exist. We have the International Energy Agency, which is basically OECD countries created in response to the oil embargoes and the energy crisis in the 1970s. There's an International Energy Forum that's meant to bridge between consumer countries and producer countries. These were generally came about because of oil, and there's OPEC, right, for oil. And the one forum that has come up that is not explicitly an energy forum, but has grown to be over the years because of in a lot of part because of market trends going on, of the declining costs of renewables and et cetera. This talk about addressing climate change becomes more about this energy transition. The UNFCCC ends up being one of these key forums for discussing this, and the only one that includes everyone. And everyone the only forum where everyone in it will have to play by the same rules in terms of information they provide about their energy use and about their energy policies. These are things that we do in the IEA with our partner countries in the OECD, where they go through these very deep dive policy reviews with other countries. And in that case, we're cooperating with them to figure out how much we need in strategic reserves and et cetera. The UNFCCC won't do things like that, but it will do these deep dives and increasingly deep dives in improving the transparency of energy policy and energy use around the world, in China, in India, in Brazil. And other countries don't necessarily need that to understand what's going on in the United States, because we have a much more transparent system overall. And so to me, that would be from just there are bigger political arguments that folks are making here one way or another that I'm commenting on less, more of just, it's a forum that will be there, it's a forum that will be increasingly important going forward for the rest of the world with the United States or not. And then that is the question that politicals need to answer of, are we better in there shaping it, or are we better, on the outside trying to do something else? I would be in favor of being in, but again, I think that's the appropriate conversation to have.
And that's the conversation we're having. With that, I assume it's okay to open it up for questions from anybody that might be in the audience, please. Yes.
Thank you. Myron Ebel, CEI. My experience of observing these international negotiations at the COPs I've never had a glimmer that being at the table serves any purpose in favor of energy. The purpose of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and of the parties to it is to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, coal first. That's what we're negotiating about when we go every year. And my question is this: according to the Chamber of Commerce, the actions undertaken through regulation by the Obama administration, plus business as usual emissions reductions, achieve 55% of our nationally determined contribution. President Trump is taking away a significant chunk of that 55%. Now the question is, if we're not going to meet the nationally determined contribution, there's no mechanism to reduce it in the treaty. Are we going to say we lie? I mean, what is the position of the United States going to be? We made this promise, which has been accepted by Congress. It's not been challenged by Congress. We made it's apparently if your advice is taken and President Trump breaks his promise, it's accepted by the Trump administration. Our NDC has been accepted by our federal government. So how can we not do what our nationally determined contribution is?
So one of my initial thought on that is it's sort of like reopening NAFTA. I mean, NAFTA is in fact a trade deal, and a new president comes along and says, we're going to reopen this and we're going to renegotiate these things. And I especially something as brand new as Paris is, and is frankly not accepted. I mean, we all know that if we called for a vote in the United States Senate, it would not be ratified. And that would be an easy way to provide political cover for the president to get out of it, and that's an option. But so call me simplistic, but I think that it's simply saying we'll stay in, but under our terms, not under the previous terms.
But there is no mechanism for withdrawing our contribution and submitting a lower one, so we would have to reopen the entire agreement. And who is going to go, is there any other country in the world, except perhaps I can think of one or two, that would support reopening the agreement?
Let me ask, good question, Myra, and thank you. And maybe, Keith, maybe you'd have some insights on this, but one of the things I get a sense of, and I couldn't start citing countries or continents even, but I do get a sense, especially perhaps among developing countries, that there's some relief that we're actually talking about this, and that they are in fact looking for some leadership to provide a more reasonable global deal. And I mean, it is what leaders do. It is what we've always been able to do as the leader in the world. Is it unreasonable to expect that we could have something more than just the United States unilaterally saying we're in or we're out or we're in with these new conditions, but have a broader discussion?
I think that there's, so on the first point, and to directly address, there's nothing in the agreement that would require the entire thing to be reopened for someone to come back in and restate their nationally determined contribution. Those are, countries are expected to have a nationally determined contribution and to say something about what they're doing to achieve it. But it doesn't require that it can't be changed, and it doesn't require that you can't change what you're doing domestically to meet your emissions goals. Now, will there be political blowback in that forum if you come in and change it and reduce it? Then certainly. The question would be how that relates to blowing up the agreement entirely of withdrawing it.
Article 4 is the only article that addresses adjustment of the NDC, and both references expressly refer to one direction. You can adjust it any way so long as it is more, quote, ambitious. So diplomatic blowback is what you invite, the supposed peril of if we get out, but is again, it's the design of Paris. Do you want to take it once or every 5 years without any of the benefits of keeping the promise to cancel U.S. participation in the treaty? But under any canon, I think, of interpretations are to go make it more ambitious. There's one direction you can adjust it. So what I've seen is a UN, UNEP and some other groups memo, I think, post November 8th saying, well, that's just a suggestion. I think they'll sing a different tune once he changes that. It will be all about diplomatic blowback. So it won't be different next time. You remember in Paris, Gina McCarthy wowed our negotiating partners with the promise that our rules were bulletproof, and everyone nodded feverishly in agreement. Everyone believed it, even though the Supreme Court, I believe, had already stated by that time. And look how it turned out. It's not going to be different next time. My colleague Sam Kasman, I have to credit, I used his line in that USA Today piece last week providing the counter view, keep your promise. He said, did you hear about the mule that kept its reins so as to not give up its leadership position? Neither have I. You won't adjust this down. This will not be a pain-free exercise, and it will likely not be successful. And if you don't want diplomatic blowback, you only get it once by withdrawing. There is no mechanism to adjust it down. You can, by the same approach that got us here, well, that's what I'm going to do. But again, you're breaking the agreement. Somehow it's the more noble position that we will, I forget how I phrased it here because it gets complicated. We will not honestly rescind the promise. That's the one, because because we have a process for this and it wasn't followed. Instead, we're just going to not keep it. That is not the more noble position. He should keep his promise.
Well, I'm just going to add a few things there. First of all, to Myron's point about what are we going to do to make up the difference, just returning us to first principles for a moment about whether we can get rid of the Clean Power Plan. I would return to the most recent data, which is just indicative of the fact that we are on target to meet obligations, largely as a result of market trends related to natural gas, as you know, and as a regard to a more energy-efficient economy, which we also have. So these have kept us, in fact, the percentage that's related to actual command and control environmental regulations is quite small, and even the architects of the CPP indicated that they weren't even, they had long given up on the notion that the CPP makes actual measurable reductions. And that's whether you parse it by individual environmental endpoints or whether you parse it by total reduction in percentage. So I'm quite comfortable in our ability to sustain the revision or elimination of the Clean Power Plan and still continue in Paris. Now, as far as the discussion on what Article 4 says or doesn't say, I'll leave that to, Horner versus Keith there. You've been reduced to your last name now.
Thank you. Yeah, this will do. So I think that the point about Article 4 is that on these provisions that do describe a sort of expectation of highest ambition, is that they are, in this case, negotiated as they were negotiated by the parties, and not just the United States, negotiated to not specifically to not be legally binding, so that it wouldn't put a country in the position that if it had to make some change to its nationally determined contribution, other countries could bring some sort of charge that it was, legally violating the agreement.
Or invade.
And, in part for recognition for a variety of reasons, but, among them are the situation that Japan found itself in several years ago after the Fukushima disaster, where they, because of the result of this natural disaster and with the nuclear power plant, they ended up taking a lot of nuclear offline, have increased, LNG imports. Countries recognize, particularly when you're dealing with single-year targets, that there can be events external to what you can control that might impact that. So that's part of the reasons that was done. One other point I guess I'd make, though, generally about the benefit of staying in the Paris Agreement, one of the things that was a very hard-won victory for a position that the U.S. has had in these climate change discussions since the very beginning of the convention is the notion that all countries would be participating in the same sort of way. In this case, all countries are doing their nationally determined contribution to determine what they would do for their goal and what they would do to implement it, but all of the countries are doing it. And it's a hard fight away from Kyoto, and one of the biggest things that sank Kyoto, as reflected in the Byrd-Hagel resolution that passed, I think, 95-0 in the late 90s, was said, don't bring back an agreement that would harm the U.S. economy. Mm-hmm. Don't bring back an agreement that treats developing countries differently, especially China, Brazil, Mexico, India. And this agreement is the biggest achievement and probably the biggest geopolitical shift in the conversation about addressing this climate change issue, was getting that equivalent footing for all countries in there without an explicit bifurcation, saying developed countries have to do something different and developing countries won't do anything. And I think it would be that, again, another strong reason to not want to cede that gain that had been made over those years of negotiation.
Very good. Yes, sir.
Dave Stevens,
We'll come back with
with the Segal Institute in Delaware. The primary reason for the discussion today seems to be that we need to have a seat at the table. When we dropped out of Kyoto, we were still at Copenhagen and Rio and Paris. If we drop out of Paris now, we're one of the energy elephants in the world. We're still going to have a seat in any discussion. By the way, it's India that is one of us to drop out of Japan. Second world population. And the other point is, all the countries are involved in Paris, but they all have very different. We made one of the biggest commitments, so we're still getting punished by it. So I happen to agree with Mr. Horner that there is no reason for us to stay in Paris, and the president should keep his promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, well said, yes.
So we've talked a lot about how the U.S. can shape the Paris deal. I'm wondering if we can kind of bring the discussion back home. What policies or regulations might we see from Congress to the federal agencies here at home if we decide to stay with Paris and continue with regulatory reform? Are we actually going to see efforts to reduce carbon in this Congress and under this president?
Sure. So I'll take the first stab at that. I think one of the things, whether where we've been talking about changing our emission standard and all that, but presuming for a moment that there's consensus that we should be addressing greenhouse gas emissions, whatever it is, whether it's 26%, 28%, 10%, I think the first thing we should do is have a more transparent discussion about what's a realistic expectation. And that's the thing that was missing so much, in my view, in both the Clean Power Plan and in Paris. And so we'd have a much more robust discussion, and I think a much more realistic one. I think the other thing is, from a congressional or from a policy standpoint, would be to not have predetermined winners and losers. And I know that sounds cliche-ish, but that's the way our research and development's been going in this country, to the degree that gas has been, low-price gas has been hard on coal. I get it. That's a market force. It shouldn't demand further, acceleration of the demise of coal by public policy. So yeah, I think you see regulatory relief, but I also think you see more of an emphasis on things like using all of the fuels and finding ways to make all of them cleaner. That's what I mean by we're the innovators. That's always been the United States' edge, has been that we're the innovators. And whether it's clean coal technology, whether it's LNG, the fact that we don't have LNG export terminals all up and down the coast of this continent is beyond me, with all that we have to sell and the high demand for it. I think from a congressional standpoint, it is a lot of regulatory reform, but I think it has a global play in that we can assist our private sector in becoming the exporter of the solution globally. And to me, that's the one advantage, and that's what I'm trying to gauge, whether Paris is the best form or the only form or the perfect form or the at least not worst form to make that case. But yes, certainly requires some things at the domestic level as well to pave that way.
So I've got a list of things that we could do that I think are consistent with conservative principles and are also consistent with free market principles. I mean, I suggested one of them earlier, that we could reform the Clean Air Act so that it doesn't penalize improvements in energy efficiency at our power plants. So I mean, that's something we could do right off the bat. Second, we extended the production tax credits and investment tax credits for wind and solar, and we could reduce the charge that picks and favors particular technologies by adding the remainder of the orphan technologies that were a part of the same agreement but just didn't get done. We could reform our national labs so that we have more applied technology as opposed to just the research that occurs currently. My favorite, we could do a little pipeline reform, both administratively and legislatively, smoothing out the rough spots on the ESA, on FERC as a lead agency, making sure that we can approve more pipeline structure on the natural gas side of the house to move more gas efficiently around the country, which we've already established as one of the major things that has been done as a market force to reduce CO2. We could change the permitting structure at NRC, at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to wake up the NRC a little bit and allow them to do better and faster approval of next generation, newer technologies for nuclear. We could, as part of the infrastructure projects, upgrade our public dams, get more electricity out of that, rather than just being 12%, have more electricity. We could improve siting of transmission lines, which allows us to move renewable electrons around the country more efficiently. These are all things we could do that lessen the footprint of the government, that make it more responsive to market demands, and that have the happy benefit of encouraging a cleaner economy and an economy with a smaller carbon footprint. So I like all that.
Yeah, and I think that's.
And Marlo does too, he just raised his hand.
And I think that's a pretty good list. I would certainly add to that in terms of looking at the Clean Air Act. One of the things that was unfortunately not included was allowing nuclear power plants to qualify for
Yes.
Clean Air Act credits for power uprates. We've had the equivalent of 5 new nuclear power plants added as a result of power uprates over the course of the last 15 years. I think we would see even more of that safe, clean power added to the grid if that change were made. I think there's a lot of utilities that would want to go
Well,
ahead
as you
and
know,
do that.
in the Environment Subcommittee tomorrow, we're going to have a very quiet, peaceful discussion even what to do about waste, as you might have read all about it, yes. Well, yeah.
I'm Marlo Lewis of Competitive Enterprise Institute. Just a quick comment on what you said, Scott, and what you said, Congressman. A lot of what you talked about can be done without regard to the Paris Agreement. It's not as if we have to be in the Paris Agreement in order to have more sensible permitting or stop penalizing.
We should do it for sure, either way, yeah.
Right. But the problem that I think people are not discussing here is that the Paris Agreement really did have an architect or a set of architects. It was set up to advance a certain agenda. And basically, what President Obama wanted out of it was to give his domestic climate agenda a treaty-like status, but without actually going through the treaty process. And so you take, for example, the Clean Power Plan, which was the biggest single component. A lot of people will say, well, yes, because of natural gas, coal was taking a beating anyway, and the Clean Power Plan itself would only, at the margin, increase the rate of retirements in coal plants. But I think what that ignores is that the Clean Power Plan was a declaration, was part of a declaration of war, implicit, that said, you're down now, we're going to kick you while you're down, and you're never going to get back up. Even if the economic picture of the United States should change and gas prices will go up, there is still not going to be a future for your industry, not because of the first set of targets under the Clean Power Plan, which run from 2022 to 2030, but because this is just the first stage. There will be a Clean Power Plan 2.0. And by the way, you'll never be able to undo that domestic framework and all the other regulations that we're putting into place, because all of that now will be folded into a promise that America is making to the world. It's called our NDC. And all our current and proposed policies only take you, it's actually only 51% of the way to meeting the NDC. And the way we've written this agreement, you're going to have to increase the ambition of that every 5 years, so that not only will certain industries have no future regardless of changes in the economy, the framework that ensures their destruction will not ever change regardless of changes in the politics of the country. It doesn't matter who my successor is, and it turns out it really did matter. But that was the strategy, that regardless of President Obama's successor, there will only be a certain policy trajectory that is permitted in the United States, regardless of the policy preferences of future presidents, Congresses, and the American people. And this is a very sinister program, in my view, and just because we seem now to be in the eye of the storm, or maybe we seem now to see some light at the end of the tunnel, what happens if the next president is a progressive like Hillary Clinton would have been today? As long as this Frankenstein monster is out there, with the right people at the top, it can revert back to exactly where Obama left it. And the only way to prevent that is to pull it up by the roots, or at least to pull us out of it, so that we are no longer under any kind of obligation, legal or moral, however you want to describe it. Because remember, when you're America, you keep your promises, it's what you do. And Obama made a promise, and that's going to haunt Trump as long as he acknowledges the legitimacy of that promise.
I think you've got the seeds of the flaw in your own argument. Marlo, you pushed it too far, because here's the point. Let's say we withdrew from Paris, and let's say the next administration would have a contrary point of view. There's nothing that would keep them from either rejoining Paris or even rejoining Paris on worse terms from a nationally determined perspective. Nothing would keep them from doing it. You have confidence, I assume, in this administration. I have confidence in this administration. I would like to see what the Paris structure will look like if the team of negotiators is not sent by Barack Obama, but is sent by Donald Trump. I want to see what that looks like. And if you still don't like it, after they attempt to do, and I acknowledge the discussion going on here about the one-way ratchet, or whether that's what Article 4 means. I think there's reason to believe that perhaps that's not what it means, although rhetorically it may seem that. But if we can dispatch a Donald Trump negotiating team to tackle Paris, I want to see what that looks like. If you still don't like it, you always could recede at that point.
I'm not on the panel, so I won't take any more time. But I'm sure Chris could answer in my stead.
No, I know Chris he's given me his proxy on this.
Is that right? I don't think it's just a rhetorical point that you can only go one way unless words have no meaning anymore. But let me just, 2 quick points. Scott Pruitt is correct. This drastically reduces the latitude of what EPA can argue to get out of the Clean Power Plan. The endangerment finding more so. But the second is, Marlo pointed out the folly of this notion that, well, we'll just adjust the first NDC. I know it's not permitted, and the claim is, well, it's not prohibited, it's a suggestion. Wait till they try it. No, then what about the next one, and the next one, and the next one? There's a reason this goes on in perpetuity and gets tighter every 5 years. Keep your promise, President Trump.
I will go back to the point that we made before, and that is that the ties between the Paris Agreement and the endangerment finding in the Clean Power Plan, we don't see it there. We don't see it in the analysis. I'm not going to defend the Clean Power Plan because I don't agree with it. I don't think that the establishment of that Clean Power Plan and the ties to the Paris Agreement are going to draw that back in. So I understand the arguments. I appreciate the degree which they're pressed, but I just don't see it. I think you can be against the Clean Power Plan and believe that it's okay for us to be in the Paris Agreement. In fact, important for us to be in the Paris Agreement. One of the comments that was made was, well, we see year after year after year of these agreements where the U.S. is going in a certain direction. That was, in fact, because we had 8 years of an Obama administration that were going that direction. I'm with Scott. I think if we have the right set of negotiators by the president who are there, that we're going to have hopefully a different outcome of the way things go. I think simply to say cede the field and allow others to take it is just, I also don't think that's the American way to do business.
My name is Jim Martin. I'm the CEO of the second largest senior citizens group in the country, the 60+ Association. We have 7 million members. And let me just comment on what Mr. Horner said about seniors. This so-called war on coal, I call it a war on seniors also. I have to speak on behalf of seniors. I can also speak on behalf of coal miners. I grew up in eastern Kentucky. My father was in the coal business all his life. He dug it for a living. And the fact is, when President Obama said we're going to necessarily, your energy costs are going to skyrocket, that was a sickening comment to this son of a coal miner, because so many coal miners have been put out of business by these regulations. Coal is still king where I come from. We need to dig it too. Besides all these other energy sources, we need to dig coal. The world needs coal. China, India, other countries. America needs coal too.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting. I mean, the coal industry has been sort of split on this very topic, as a matter of fact. And yeah, I'm come from coal country, of course, in North Dakota. That's what's kept our rates so low for so long, and it's been incredible to our economy. In fact, I'll just tell you, when I was a regulator, the wind companies loved me because I cared. I always thought a bird dumb enough to fly into a wind turbine shouldn't be protected. So, I was a good site regulator, but I never allowed it in, I always voted against allowing it in the rate base because, I figured if Minnesotans wanted to mandate it and pay extra for it, we'll build all the wind farms and you need them, send the energy over there. But I didn't want North Dakotans to have to pay for it. The problem became then all of a sudden the wind gets, primacy on the transmission lines, and now it's getting a little bit cluttered out there, and it's created a pretty big problem. So I'm with you, Jim, on coal, and I that's why my search for discovery here is to find out what's best for all forms of energy, including coal, and I'm not convinced that getting out is for sure, but you're not, and we're gonna, yeah, please do that, and then we'll come back to you now.
Your coal companies may be not quite with us on this, the smaller coal companies. Some of those bigger, and some of them, I guess, are in bankruptcy or that way.
Yeah.
But that doesn't still allow them the right to weigh in, quite frankly, I don't think so, on that particular issue about coal.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we'll end with this one.
I'm with Jim Martin and seniors, but I would like to make a comment that reinforces both what Marlo and Jim seem to be suggesting, Congressman, and that is the politicization of this issue. That's not being denied. The last man standing in the coal industry is Bob Murray, and he's the subject of a hit job in New York Times editorial page today with his $300,000 contribution to the normal. If you look at the money in the last campaign, there are arguments that a good half to two-thirds of the Democratic side of the aisle came from this issue. This issue has been politicized. President Obama did more than just start when he commented in first year of his second term that if you don't agree with me, you belong to the Flat Earth Society. And Secretary Kerry and other officials of his administration have represented that view to the UN. And that continues to be a mainstream thought over there. And it's time we recognize that there are new technologies like biorefinery, part of those other technologies that is catching on, Dayer's principle. And it's just, I think it's critical for this Congress to, and I worked here in this Congress for 20 years and was there doing the Byrd resolution. I think it's critical for us to recognize that if you want to have a rational discussion, you need to get a little bit of the politicization out and the party differences out of this discussion.
I don't disagree. I think you make a great point, and it's a good one to end. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just to respond to
Chris,
the, sort of the American way part, but also coal. I heard something coming in. Check and see if the coal industry has spoken today. I heard something coming in that marginalized these people hoping for a new windfall. They don't represent the industry is what I was told, and I think they've spoken. About the American way comment. There is an American way, and we have a process for these things, and it wasn't followed. Not staying in a deal that our negotiating partners acknowledged at the time had to be kept from the people's elected representatives. It was in all the popular press.
Yeah.
Staying in that is not necessarily the American way. It's following the process. This is the agreement. That seems to have been missed here. The Paris Agreement is the agreement. Details to follow, but this is the agreement, and it's tighter every 5 years. If you have confidence in this and the arguments, one thing missing from the Segal wish list was a Senate vote. We have a process for this. You have a good idea for Congress, Scott. One dog not barking. It had a tennis ball stuffed in its mouth, taped and stuffed in a Buick somewhere, not barking. The Senate vote on the Paris Treaty. Let's have the arguments. Great. Why shouldn't we be more like Europe? Why not? And Mexico? Why does the U.S. have to be the outliers and have the only Senate not permitted to vote on this?
Well, let's allow that to be your closing comment. We'll just keep coming this way since Keith has his hand raised next. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, and I guess for my closing comment, to keep it brief, I would just say that there is, picking up on the American way of entering these agreements and figuring out what works in our system for these agreements. And it was followed with this agreement in the same way that we've done it, and by we I mean sort of civil servant lawyers at the State Department for as long as I know. And we do that by looking at what the constitutional authorities are and the statutory authorities are and the treaties that we've already joined are in this country without regard to what other countries might do under their systems. I don't see how Europe goes about joining an agreement, or Mexico or Russia, for that matter, is relevant to determining how we decide we implement international law in the United States, and we do that by our Constitution, which this followed that process. Thank you very much.
Jeff?
Well, thank you for putting this together. I think it's been a good
A lot more fun than a
good
hearing.
exchange of views today. I mean, I think, obviously we got some differences here. I think coming into it, I continue to believe there are important reasons why the United States needs to be at the table. We are a leader in energy. I think that, frankly, I understand the concerns that have been raised. Many of these agreements over the years have gone in a direction that are not in our country's best interest. I think we do have an opportunity going forward to shape the worldview on climate change and on the use of appropriate technologies to make that happen. I think American technologies could be disadvantaged. Frankly, coal could be further disadvantaged by our not being in that agreement. And so I think empowering the right set of negotiators with the right set of negotiating principles to go back and make a better deal is the right way to do it.
Thank you. Well, what have we learned? We've learned that Paris does not create enforceable obligations. I think we learned at the very front end of this discussion, because it was not submitted for ratification. In fact, former EPA administrators and other officials have been punished for even suggesting that it might have enforceable obligations. So we know that if we have a progressive, important, well-thought-out regulatory reform agenda, as I think we almost do, because the President's executive order was a good starting point with respect to a clean power plan, social cost of carbon, other issues, but there's more to be done. We know that we can accomplish much or all of that, even if we stay within the confines of Paris, because they're not really confines. They don't confine our activity, at least from a domestic perspective. Though I'll leave you with this one idea. Have a little faith in your new administration. We're 100 days in. A lot of people, mostly on the far left, have suggested that the world is ending because of the 100 days, of the first 100 days of the Trump administration, when in fact it's a mixed record. I'm not here to say that everything is wonderful or everything is horrible. But I do treasure the notion that a Trump-appointed negotiating team that decamps to address the problems of the Paris Accord would generate a much different-looking document, one that could be encouraging for both baseload and renewable sources of power in the United States, for coal. I mean, I've worked hard for baseload power that uses traditional fossil fuels, and I think we could get a better deal out of it if we allow this administration to do what this administration does. So what I'd say is, with respect to the Trump approach to administering and negotiating in Paris, just have a little faith.
With that, I thank all of you. Like I said, this is not only more enjoyable, but I think a lot more meaningful than a congressional hearing. Maybe a little more chaotic too, but that's a thanks to all of you for your participation, for your expertise and your thoughtfulness. And I will close by saying this about the first 100 days. I think they have been remarkable, and certainly for my home state of North Dakota, they've been very, very productive. And if we can get that dumb methane rule CRA to get a 50th senator in the next couple of days, that would make it even all the better. So I was only kidding about the birds, you guys, just so you know. I was a little bit. Anyway, but thank you all for your participation.